Okay, let's go ahead and get started so we can maximize the time we have our guest. So thank you all for coming out for this CREES noon lecture on this rainy winter day. That seems a little bit odd, but thank you. My name is Elizabeth King. I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at University of Michigan, and I'm happy to welcome you to our event today, which is kindly sponsored by Comparative Literature, History Department, and Slavic Languages and Literatures. So we thank them for co-sponsoring our event and hopefully bringing some more interdisciplinary folks out for this talk today. Before I introduce Dr. Kovačević, I want to just give you we have a lot of various events that CREES is sponsoring and co-sponsoring, and that I want to draw your attention to, and I'll go through them quickly, but there's much more materials about them out on the table outside that you can grab on your way out, and or if you're not yet on our listserv, you're welcome to leave your contact information and join that. So tomorrow, CREES is happy to co-sponsor an event up at the School of Public Health across campus on thinking about treatment of opioid dependency in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And then on these are the remaining CREES noon lecture events. Our next one won't be until March, and then April, and April 15th will round out. So we still have 3 more CREES noon lectures. As I mentioned, there's more material up there as well. And then some of our upcoming co-sponsored events on Friday. Can Slavic Speak for Minorities? Who Gets to Belong in Eastern Europe? Talk 5, which will be presented by CREES Faculty Associate Greta Euling. And February 23rd, Monday at 4 p.m. in the Michigan League. Alex Overbach will be presenting on Ukrainian poetry and remembrance from his new book, Furious Harvests. On the 24th, CREES is happy to co-sponsor the WC teach-in on Ukraine, Where Are We Today, 4 Years Into the War, which will take place, right here in this room at 5 p.m. on February 24th. And then on February 25th, the International Institute is hosting a roundtable teach-in, The World at a Tipping Point, U.S. Foreign Policy Through a Global Lens. That will be up on the 10th floor at noon. And then back here in this room at 4 p.m. There will be a WC lecture, The Roots of Russia's War on Ukraine, by Serhiy Yakelchik, Professor of History and Slavic Studies from the University of Victoria. So those are some kind of a glimpse of what is yet to come in a busy couple of weeks for here at the International Institute and across campus. But you all came here today for the CREES noon lecture, Nonalignment and Decolonial Imagination, Yugoslav Literary Encounters with the Global South, which is also part of, I understand, one of your first stops on your book tour for Dr. Kovačević's new book, which is also for sale outside at the table. If you want to purchase it, you're welcome to do that as well. Nataša Kovačević is a professor of post-colonial literature at Eastern Michigan University. Her research concerns the literature and cinema of migration to the European Union, global socialism, and anti-colonial internationalisms during the Cold War. The talk today will draw on her most recent book, Non-Aligned Imagination, Yugoslavia, the Global South, and Literary Solidarities Beyond the Cold War Blocs, which was published by Northwestern University Press in 2025. She's also the author of Narrating Post-Communism, Colonial Discourse, and Europe's Borderline Civilization, and Uncommon Alliances, Cultural Narratives of Migration in the New Europe. Dr. Kovačević's essays have appeared in leading journals, including Comparative Literature Studies, Modern Fiction Studies, Cultural Critique, Post-Colonial Studies, and Interventions, the International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies. So I will turn it over to Dr. Kovačević. We'll give a lecture. We'll have time for Q&A towards the end of today's session. So, are you going to put the microphone on?
Yes, I will. All
right.
Put it on hopefully before.
Okay.
Let me just see if I can.
Thank you.
right, I think that should work, right? Oh, hold on. Probably want to go back to my presentation.
Advertisement for Okta.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
We take all sponsors.
Okay. First of all, I'm very excited to be here. This is the second stop on my international tour of the book. The first one was in Canada, in Toronto. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much to CREES for inviting me, and also to Elizabeth King and Liz Malinkin who organized this event. I also want to thank Aliyah Khan for her support and for helping coordinate the visit. And aside from CREES, of course, thank you to Slavic and Comparative Literature and History for co-sponsoring this talk. So I will start with a story. This is Petar Guberina and Emil Cesaire. Petar Guberina, Yugoslav and Croatian linguist, cultural critic, and diplomat, describes the beginning of his lifelong friendship with Martinican poet and politician Emil Cesaire, whom he met when they were both students in Paris in the 1930s, as follows. "We lived on half a kilo of bread for months. Poverty brought us together. In the summer of 1935, Cesaire, too poor to travel back to Martinique, visited Guberina, a child of peasants, in his native Šibenik on the Adriatic coast, where the nearby island of Martinska reminded him of Martinique, and where he famously began writing his notebook of return to the native land. Guberina notes that Cesaire saw firsthand that workers' and peasants' lives in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia were as difficult as they were in Martinique. It was at that moment that Cesaire understood that, quote, the battle against racism has to go hand in hand with the battle against fascism and human injustice. So as Cesaire observes in a 1990 documentary that reunites the two friends, visiting Šibenik set something off in me. I rediscovered my own country. That same year, Guberina, like many Yugoslavs of his time, was following with alarm the news about fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. So he became interested in African colonialism, the Negritude movement, and anti-colonial activism through the friendships he formed in Paris with Cesaire, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and Léon Demas, as he says, determining encounters which orient a life. The connection he made between the battles against racism and fascism would mark the rest of his life. Guberina became a member of the communist resistance movement during World War II, then a post-war diplomat performing balancing acts between the US and USSR, and a founder of the Institute for African Studies in Socialist Yugoslavia. He wrote the preface to Césaire's notebook when it was published in Présence Africaine, was received in Césaire's words as a true brother at the Congresses of Black Writers and Artists in Paris and Rome, published edited collections of Black poetry in Yugoslavia, and authored numerous articles on negritude. So Guberina's biography is typical of this era.
Here. Oh, there we go. Actually, no, it was on. So
It was on, so I don't know.
maybe
Can
it's
you?
a little bit-
I will.
Yes.
I will enunciate.
So Guberina's biography, right, is typical of this era. Many Yugoslav intellectuals' lives unfolded in similar ways against the backdrop of World War II anti-fascist struggle and concurrent communist revolution, and after the war, Yugoslavia's non-aligned foreign policy. So similar to newly independent countries in the global south, Yugoslavia was preoccupied with developing a multi-ethnic, socialist, and autonomous culture. And it saw itself as a country forged out of resistance to centuries-long Ottoman and Habsburg imperial rule, out of the popular struggle for liberation from Nazi occupation, as well as from exploitation by Western capital, and after the 1948 break with Stalin, out of evading Soviet control. So seeking a third-way alternative to Cold War bloc politics, it turned to the global south, forging political, economic, and cultural links with post-colonial states and anti-colonial liberation movements through the non-aligned movement, of which it was a founding member in 1961. So I'm going to be referring to the non-aligned movement as NAM. So NUM, the largest international alliance, still exists, situated predominantly in the global south, spanned political and economic systems, uniting members in opposition to superpower politics and around policies of nuclear disarmament, active peaceful coexistence, active anti-colonialism, and preservation of national sovereignty. So during the Cold War, NUM wielded significant leverage in the United Nations, UNESCO, and other international bodies as it presented a united front against racism and apartheid, and participated in developing policies that aimed to reform the world economy along more equitable lines. So, as has been said, right, this talk draws on my recent book, Nonaligned Imagination, Yugoslavia, the Global South, and Literary Solidarities Beyond the Cold War Blocs, which reconstructs the forgotten literary and cultural history and intellectual history also of this movement in general and of Yugoslavia's non-aligned orientation in particular, and which resulted in cultural exchanges, literary translations, and a host of prominent writers, journalists, and scholars traveling between East and South. So during the era of decolonization, as Césaire's and Senghor's examples show, questions of cultural politics, aesthetics, and autonomy were at the forefront of struggles for independent nationhood. Writers carried enormous prestige due to their statuses as both anti-colonial leaders and decolonial thinkers devoted to developing a new cultural expression and critical discourse. So we need only think of the intellectual influence wielded by Angolan poet and president Agostinho Neto, Congo's Patrice Lumumba, Martinique's and Algeria's Frantz Fanon, or Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. In socialist Yugoslavia, too, a significant number of officials occupying prominent political and diplomatic posts were, like Guberina, writers, journalists, or scholars, and many had been communist partisans in World War II. So non-aligned histories illuminate the intertwining of culture and politics, especially the role played by transnational literary and cultural battlefields in Cold War political conflicts. So you may have seen the recent documentary, Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, about American jazz diplomacy, dispatching Louis Armstrong and Nina Simone across Africa to kind of win hearts and minds at the time when the U.S. was also kind of conspiring in the removal of African leaders such as Lumumba, right, on whom the film centers. So during the Cold War, the U.S. Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was subsequently exposed in 1967 as a CIA front organization, funded a number of prominent conferences, scholarships, and journals for writers from the Global South, including Black Orpheus in Nigeria, Quest in India, and Hiwar in Lebanon. In turn, the Soviet Union was one of the primary sponsors and a major influence of the Afro-Asian Writers Association, which organized congresses, published the literary magazine Lotus, and fostered solidarity among anti-colonial writers. So these sponsorships aim to further, to an extent, of course, like U.S. and Soviet cultural and political agendas. But as we know from recent scholarship, many post-colonial authors also managed to maintain a position of creative autonomy that eluded these agendas. So Cold War studies have recently begun to turn more to the agency of actors located in the Global South, going beyond the usual narrative of the conflict between East and West, between communist and capitalist-aligned blocs. Even so, non-alignment remains an infrequent and marginal topic, and it is often passed over in favor of the 1955 Bandung Conference, the first meeting of the representatives of newly independent African and Asian countries, and of Afro-Asian solidarities that emerged from it. Of course, the many anti-colonial internationalist movements of this era are quite entangled and difficult to discuss separately. So non-alignment, right, in its ambition to present an alternative to Cold War divisions and superpower influence, both intersects with and diverges from contemporaneous initiatives such as Afro-Asianism, tricontinentalism, and Pan-Africanism, for instance. Yugoslav archives, as well as a range of narrative genres, from fiction, diaries, and travel writing to reportage and literary scholarship, published between the 1950s and the 1980s, allow us to trace the development of alternative, non-aligned epistemologies cultural networks, and anti-colonial discourses, which witness and respond to critical Cold War events, fostering both intellectual engagement and affective solidarity with the decolonizing world. Most immediately, these nonaligned narratives attempt to reconfigure the understanding of the global for their Yugoslav audiences outside of established Eurocentric tropes and hegemonic Cold War bipolarism, but also to articulate the Yugoslavs' own internationalist sensibility, where their contribution to the struggle against discrimination and exploitation and colonialism around the world is presented as an extension of their liberation struggle in World War II. So such texts connect Yugoslavia with 1950s India, 1960s Algeria and Guinea, and 1970s Vietnam, for instance. So they demonstrate how these spaces drew on one another as they entered into dialogue over literary aesthetics and engaged cultural work. So while many writers and intellectuals who authored such texts are well known for publishing in other genres, such as fiction, right? For example, Nobel laureate Ivo Andrić, also the Grozdana Olović, or poetry, Oskar Davičo, who we have here, World War II memoirs, Rodoljub Čolaković, and literary criticism, Svetozar Petrović, also featured here. And also, I want to point out that one of the authors I study is also Čedomir Minderović, and I'm very pleased that his son Zoran is in the audience with us today. So, very thrilled about that. So all of these authors are pretty well known, right, for publishing in a number of different genres in Yugoslavia at the time. But the aforementioned texts appear marginal to their body of work and have been almost entirely overlooked by scholarship since the 1990s. After socialist Yugoslavia dissolved into ethno-nationalist states, which have been erasing the history of both socialism and non-alignment. So official historical revisionism, both right-wing and liberal, presents Yugoslav socialism primarily as a variety of totalitarianism. And it often downplays its anti-fascist, anti-colonial, and egalitarian legacies. So revisiting these texts and their authors' at times profound involvement with Yugoslavia's cultural diplomacy in spaces yields the contours of what I called the non-aligned imagination, a recognizable discursive formation which gathers around recurrent preoccupations. So for instance, how does the confrontation with global inequality and racialized capitalism in the post-colony give rise to new forms of subjectivity? How does one do justice to marginalized perspectives in the acts of narrating new nations? What enables or obstructs meaningful cultural exchange and literary translation among non-aligned countries? How can an engaged author, in this case an engaged Yugoslav author, be a successful fellow traveler, but also literally traveler, and honor the non-aligned ethics of non-interference, right, or non-imposition of one's cultural worldview? Yugoslavia differentiated itself, especially, from Soviet ambitions, for instance, by refusing to proffer its socialist framework as a model, right, for other non-members to emulate. So in the spirit of non-alignment, right, it emphasized this multiplicity of development paths that were to be based on specific experiences, needs, and traditions of each nation. We can address, of course, these questions only while making transparent the author's very privilege to travel and to represent. So while many of these non-aligned encounters were facilitated through state-coordinated policies that supported certain types of cultural production, there is a diversity of cultural discourses that exceed, modify, and even go against official NUM ideals. And so this is what recent scholarship has come to call non-alignment from below. So non-alignment from below was often unpredictable in Yugoslavia, and at times more radical than official discourses and policies, as, for example, evidenced by uncontainable popular protests. These were kind of like initially state-coordinated, but then they got out of control. So uncontainable popular protests over Lumumba's murder, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Vietnam War. Yugoslav intellectuals were also at times more radical or more progressive than politicians, right, who were criticized by their non-partners because they didn't consistently pursue the causes of liberation from colonialism. So while Yugoslavia, for instance, backed US-aligned Honduras in the 1980s, its literary journals were featuring translations of contemporary Nicaraguan poetry and discussions of Sandinista politics, interviews with Sandinista figures and so on. Beyond politicians and intellectuals, a general culture inspired by non-alignment solidified through the establishment of unique venues where artists from both sides of the Iron Curtain and from non-aligned countries could meet and exchange their creative visions. So such kind of third spaces included the Ljubljana Biennale of Graphic Arts, the Struga Poetry Evenings, which hosted prominent writers such as Senegalese poet, of course, and first president, Senghor, who I've already mentioned, Indian Amrita Pritam, Chilean Pablo Neruda, but also Soviet poets like Bulat Okudjava and US poets like Clarence Major and Allen Ginsberg. And another kind of third space can be or we can think of it as a third space, the avant-garde Belgrade International Theater Festival, or BITEF, which featured Césaire's play The Tragedy of King Christophe in 1968. And this was 2 years after its performance at the First World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar, and 54 years before its North American premiere. Non-aligned artists also exhibited at the Museum of African Arts in Belgrade and the Josip Broz Tito Gallery for the Art of the Non-Aligned Countries in Podgorica. The Belgrade Student Cultural Center organized roundtables on anti-colonial leftist movements, often hosting exiled activists. For instance, in the 1970s, that would have been like a lot of the Argentinians and Chileans who escaped to Yugoslavia to flee dictatorships. So programs for distributing scholarships and for the exchange of students, scholars, and experts among NAM members were established. And so over 40,000 such students passed through the University of Belgrade alone. So efforts to counter informational imperialism, where a handful of Euro-American news agencies controlled virtually all global news, resulted in the cooperative non-aligned news agencies pool, a news exchange platform based in Yugoslavia that operated on the principle of barter. So tracing the history of anti-colonial thought and culture inflected by non-alignment helps us understand how it both intersected with concurrent global critiques of colonialism, as well as shaped the local understanding of racial and cultural difference in Yugoslavia. So many texts of this era highlight this affinity with anti-colonial liberation movements based on similar historical experiences. Because of its peripheral geopolitical status, Yugoslavia saw itself and was often seen as naturally non-aligned and ideally positioned to champion independence from colonial powers without the ulterior motive of neocolonial interference. Of course, this is, again, in contrast, right, from their perspective to the Soviet Union or China, for instance. Unlike Europe's overseas empires, however, the Balkans, right, perceived as predominantly white and Christian, have not been treated as Europe's absolute others, but rather as its incomplete selves. So while they shared with non-European colonies the position of structural underdevelopment, exacerbated by the exploitation of their agrarian labor and natural resources by foreign capital, as a whole, of course, they were not subject to systemic slavery and racism in the service of a globally expanding capitalist modernity, even as that modernity came on the heels of the medieval enslavement of Slavs and other groups across the Eastern Mediterranean, and was concurrent with centuries of Romani enslavement in present-day Romania. So this asymmetry can result in East European blindness to full-fledged coloniality, but it also carries epistemic potential for the comparative study of different structures of colonial governance. So Yugoslav narratives that engaged with the non-aligned world explored such comparisons and in turn shaped social dispositions and material decisions. So for instance, since Yugoslav communists considered the Kingdom of Yugoslavia a colony of Western capital, their support for nationalizing natural resources and infrastructure after the revolution translated into solidarity with post-colonial efforts to nationalize foreign-owned assets. And it also led to greater attention to cultural representation and self-representation in narrative modes. So as attested by journalist and writer Radonja Vešević's refusal to reinforce harmful stereotypes in his 1970s travelogue on Vietnam. So he says, those things sometimes pulled me away from the real Vietnam and toward the exotic one. They blinded me, but only for a moment. If I were to submit to those kinds of impressions, it would be the same as if a Western visitor arriving in our country after the liberation were to focus on colorful Balkan folklore instead of our main achievement, historic changes brought about by the 4-year war against fascism and internal enemies. Yugoslav nonaligned narratives, however, suggest a fraught relationship with race, where whiteness is both disavowed and desired. Sometimes their authors meticulously analyze the systemic racism that underpins colonialism, expressing close affinity with the colonized peoples, given their own not quite white status in the European imaginary. As white Europeans in post-colonial countries, however, they also struggle with or even renounce their racial privilege and at times display Eurocentric superiority, revealing the Yugoslav region's immersion in transnational racialized registers. So I'd now like to move to several examples of the types of literary encounters in the non-aligned world that I've been talking about. So the fundamental question that preoccupied these intellectuals and writers concerned the role that literature and culture should play in a world after empire, imagined as polycentric rather than bipolar. So in Yugoslavia, engagement with the non-aligned world inspired travel writing that galvanized support for anti-colonial revolutions, exchange and translation networks that connected peripheral literatures without metropolitan mediation, aesthetic innovations that departed from Western modernism and Soviet socialist realism, and shared decolonial critical vocabularies that developed alongside material solidarities. So when it comes to engaged travel writing, Yugoslavs joined, of course, transnational cultural battlefronts in a situation where anti-colonial movements used sympathetic literary and cinematic accounts of their struggles to their benefit and sought them actively. So travel was crucial to orienting the country's internationalist outlook and nurturing diplomatic relations, especially with non-aligned countries. Yugoslavia both executed and hosted an enormous number of diplomatic visits and developed an extensive network of consulates around the world. It was also the first socialist government to visit sub-Saharan Africa. And in addition to this, right, Yugoslavia had an open-door tourist policy, and Yugoslavs were able to travel to both blocs and non-aligned countries from the early 1960s onward, right? So it's kind of, for the most part. So this resulted in literally hundreds of travel narratives about many countries. But I will discuss the genre that I call revolutionary travelogue, which illuminates the interconnectedness of narrative aesthetics, cultural diplomacy, and political decisions. They're revolutionary not only in that they document, actual revolutions and liberation movements in Algeria, Kenya, the Congo, Vietnam, but also in that they intervene in representational registers by attempting to develop new cultural frames of reference that aspire to depart from Eurocentrism. So just to give you a sense of what they do, so they critique, they advance criticisms of colonial racism and classism. They often reflect on the author's own perspective and prejudice. They attempt to foreground historically kind of marginalized narratives, typically kind of a class, like marginalized kind of classes, the workers and peasants, right, kind of in keeping with the socialist framework, and advance, decolonial historiography while staging independent nations through emancipated revolutionary subjects. So in this ambition to write independence into reality, this genre echoes conventions from Yugoslav partisan literature and art in World War II, where battles against the Axis powers were similarly fought on both political and cultural battlefronts. So nonetheless, while the authors of revolutionary travelogues at times display profound self-reflexiveness, and other times they observe non-European others from positions of Eurocentric privilege and superiority. So These texts also establish affective continuity between Yugoslavia's war of liberation from Nazi rule and decolonial struggles in the global south, many of which Yugoslavia supported through both military and non-military aid. So Yugoslav laws and constitutions mandated aid to liberation movements. But this was also one of the larger principles of NAM, to quote Amilcar Cabral, a cornerstone of non-alignment. So these travelogues carry authority because many of their authors, almost for this particular genre, almost exclusively men, were not only journalists, writers, and diplomats, or scholars, but also former partisans who both understood the strategies of guerrilla warfare and commanded respect as veterans. So supplementing other types of aid, cultural diplomacy could be an effective weapon for liberation movements in their fight against the superior military of a colonial power. As was the case, for example, with the Algerian War of Independence, where it led to the revolutionary government being treated as the de facto Algerian government in much of the world before official independence. So Yugoslavia's support for Algeria's National Liberation Front, or FLN, helps illustrate the range and multiple levels of involvement. So Yugoslav authorities offered political and logistical support, supplied the Algerian army with weapons, maintained a Red Cross field hospital for wounded guerrillas and refugees in Tunisia, and provided humanitarian aid. So the FLN represented the country, of course, at the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade in 1961. Journalist and cultural worker Veda Zagorec was extensively involved in the film, media, and scholarly publicity that enlisted support for Algerian independence in her role as the Yugoslav cultural attaché in Tunisia. So she oversaw the publication as a 3-volume monograph of the collected wartime issues of FLN's newspaper Al Mujahid in Belgrade, as well as the dispatch of Yugoslav film crews to produce newsreels in Algeria. So Algerian and Yugoslav crews collaborated on producing the footage of the Algerian army, portraying them as skillful and successful guerrillas, which challenged the stereotypes of French films that presented them often as ruthless terrorists that lacked popular support and portrayed the French as benevolent colonizers. And you can actually see this contrast in the recent documentaries by Mila Turajlić, Nonaligned and Semi-Guerrillas, where she juxtaposes Algerian and French newsreels. She also contrasts, for instance, the Yugoslav footage of the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade with the US footage, whose tone is kind of mocking and patronizing and also racist, as they describe this summit as a meeting of random nations, right? And they literally compare it to a collection of zoo animals. So at this time, right, a number of sympathetic Yugoslav travelogues about Algeria, as well as political science and history books emerged. So I will just focus briefly on Zdravko Pečar, who was a journalist, diplomat, and history scholar, and also husband of Veda Zagorec. And he published a number of books on Africa in general and on Algeria and Egypt in particular, in combining reportage, political analysis, and travel narrative. So in these texts, Pečar analyzes racist discourses and their role in the maintenance of colonial hierarchies, includes interviews with African independence figures such as Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Fanon, and linking culture and politics, discusses Black arts movements, negritude poetry, and oral literary traditions, to mention a few topics. So in his doctoral dissertation, which you can see here, which was published as Alger do Nezavisnosti, or Algeria Until Independence in 1967, he states that his goal is to write an anti-colonial history of Algeria and challenge its, quote, conscious falsification at the hands of not just French colonial rulers, but of European historiography, which considers Algeria as a land with no history or tradition. So in this book, in addition to European, North African, Ottoman, and other books and archives, Pečar draws on contemporary decolonial thinkers, including Fanon and Ferhat Abbas, as well as a variety of local sources like FLN's proclamations from Al Mujahid, unpublished military reports, prison diaries and testimonies, war memoirs, and interviews he collects as a, quote, participant, eyewitness, and daily chronicler of the war. So the subsequent independence of Algeria and many other countries opened up the possibility of a new cultural politics, and travel became a way to establish networks of literary collaboration that would have been impossible earlier. So in the context of US and Soviet battles for cultural independence or cultural influence that I mentioned earlier, staking out a third position was to engage in a practice of peripheral internationalism, which, at least in the Yugoslav case, I would argue, unfolded between pragmatism, political conviction, and emancipatory idealism. So this third, non-aligned positioning, for the most part, did not preclude cultural cooperation with either bloc, but it frequently assumed a detached and apprehensive stance toward both. So Yugoslavia saw its role as a mediator between the blocs and the non-aligned world, as inclusive international literary events like the 1965 Penn Congress, for instance, in Bled, or the numerous Struga poetry evenings testify. So, for instance, although they were ambivalent about Penn as an organization dominated by Western countries, Yugoslavs approached this Congress as the third space that could bring together authors as diverse as Pablo Neruda, Miguel Ángel Asturias, Jamil Amrani, Arthur Miller, Susan Sontag, and Leonid Leonov, to mention just a few names. So this was the first Penn Congress hosted by a socialist country and attended by Soviet observers. So beyond attending literary festivals, cultural agreements between non-aligned countries made possible state-sponsored literary exchange programs and travel on a particular mission, right? So to make contact with particular writers, publishers, editors, discuss reciprocal translations and publications, create maybe like alternatives to literary markets that are dominated by major world languages or major publishers. And so creating these like independent publishing and translation markets was crucial, given that, as Peter Kalini has shown, superpower cultural diplomacy actually retarded the development of local publishing industries, which had to compete against heavily subsidized imports. So according to Kenyan writer and publisher David Mailu, in 1972, the entire continent of Africa published 15 times fewer books than the United States or the Soviet Union alone. So these collaborative translation and publication projects often emphasized the importance of egalitarianism, respect for local preferences, and explicit acts of solidarity and generosity. So, for example, Ivo Andrić renounced his royalties for the translation and publication in Venezuela of his early essay on Simón Bolívar, and was praised for this gesture in Venezuelan press. So the essay was posthumously published in Venezuela and Yugoslavia in 1982 and 1983, respectively, to mark the bicentennial of Bolívar's birth. So I will just briefly discuss this project as an example of enlisting certain literary works to support kind of non-aligned and, I guess, broadly anti-colonial politics, especially as the initiator of this translation, former Venezuelan ambassador to Yugoslavia, Simón Alberto Consalvi, was himself, of course, a writer and journalist. And so Venezuela was not an official member of NAM until 1989, but it was an observer at various NAM meetings, increasingly collaborated with the movement as it sought to establish its own economic sovereignty. So the bilingual Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian, and Spanish edition of Andrić's essay, Bolívar, Permanent Liberation, affirmed this ideological orientation by including Neruda's and Venezuelan writer Miguel Otero Silva's poems dedicated to Bolívar, as well as a critical article authored by the Yugoslav translator and scholar Zagor Kalilić. So her article draws historical parallels between South America and the Balkans as distant spaces that undergo almost identical, in her words, experiences of liberation from foreign domination, engendering cognate ideas about unifying Latin American South Slavic nations. Lilić argues that by writing an essay in 1930, Andrić implicitly addresses the problem of royal dictatorship and in pre-revolution Yugoslavia. So a similar focus on the common struggle for national sovereignty informs the foreword to the text, authored by Venezuelan historian and Bolívar scholar José Luis Alcedo Bastardo. He presents Andrić as a brave revolutionary fighting for independence, justice, and national unity, whose intimate knowledge of the cultural complexity of Bosnia inspired his interest in the similarly multicultural South America of Bolívar's time. So while this is a potentially productive reading of Andrić's essay, it substantially streamlines the complexity, right, of his portrayal of Bolivar. Just give me a second, I just lost my space. Okay. So in this character study, Andrić emphasizes Bolivar's modern outlook shaped by the Enlightenment, which commits him to social justice against the backdrop of racial and economic inequalities across South America. But as governor, he submits to hubris, becoming, quote, bitter and unjust, exhibiting dictatorial tendencies in his opposition to democratic representation and complaining that people do not deserve the freedom he gave them. So while Andrić describes Bolivar's later years as steeped in existential aimlessness and a sense of betrayal, his final judgment nonetheless rests on the historical inevitability of Bolivar's actions and praise for his visionary anticipation of a global league of nations that unites different continents around principles of, quote, solidarity, common interests, and mandatory arbitration in case of conflict. That this future community implicitly resembles a proto-NAM, or even a proto-United Nations through which NAM exerted much of its influence, lends itself not only to the strengthening of Yugoslav-Venezuelan friendship, but also to the endorsement of the broader movement that made such a relationship possible. So the essay's ending and the spirit of permanent liberation that Bolivar represents shape its paratextual framing, while simplifying its complex character sketch to fit a particular image of a heroic and, of course, male revolutionary. So in Yugoslavia, literary encounters with the nonaligned world were accompanied also by the rise in critical scholarship that explored the relationship between literature, revolution, decolonization, and nonaligned politics, and this will be my last example today. This scholarship was often concurrent with actual struggles for independence, anticipating, post-colonial theory that developed in Western academia following Edward Said's Orientalism in the late 70s. Yugoslav archives and publications are also valuable in that they document exchanges with prominent intellectual and political figures from the global South, right? Which is Lumumba, Senghor, Fanon, Salvador Allende, Nguyen Thi Binh, and so on. And so in showcasing and engaging with their ideas, they allow us to reverse the secondary importance to which these figures have been relegated in subsequent post-colonial scholarship. And so in the critical sphere, the counterpart to nonaligned principles of respect for national sovereignty and independence from superpower influence was a similarly decentralized strand of Marxist thought that developed in conversation with thinkers from the global South. And often also like in either implicit or explicit opposition to kind of the communist models, right? Like let's say of the Chinese or Soviet variety. Yugoslav scholars' readings of Fanon, for instance, advocate an anti-colonial Marxist humanism, criticize bureaucratic socialism, promote decentralized action, and often prioritize race as an analytic category. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their engagement with Fanon's work especially. So his first book to be translated in Yugoslavia is The Wretched of the Earth. It shows up in Slovenian translation in 1963. Of course, prior to that, a lot of scholars who engaged with Fanon would have been reading him in, the original French or possibly in like English translation. But there are kind of like these introductory essays to Fanon even prior to the full book translations. But nonetheless, it is apt that Wretched of the Earth was the first text to be translated, given that its revolutionary ardor enables the same kind of affective mobilization as the Yugoslav travel accounts from the global South that advocate liberation from colonialism that are published around the same time. So Fanon also kind of embodies this era's ideal of an intellectual revolutionary, right? One whose political insights are shaped by his direct engagement with military, diplomatic, and cultural praxis. So also in Wretched, he comes across as an essentially non-aligned thinker who promotes universal revolution and a distancing from both Cold War blocs. So when they translate him, even though Fanon, of course, never uses the word non-aligned, but they always translate him and they use like non-engaged, right? Even though he's saying like third world, right? So he's kind of like, but he does kind of promote this distancing from the Cold War blocs, but also much like Yugoslavs themselves aspire, right, crosses racial, cultural, and religious lines, right, identifying with Algeria's cause while being neither Algerian nor Muslim. So Yugoslav intellectuals' invariably enthusiastic evaluations of Fanon's work also reveal an investment in thinking the Yugoslav revolution as part of a global emancipatory wave. So, for instance, they might agree with Fanon's critique of bourgeois nationalism, observing that its class fragmentation becomes especially stark in revolts against foreign occupiers, a common experience that they say links, Yugoslavia, Algeria, and Vietnam. His work is appealing for its very focus on the Algerian War, which, as I noted, was seen as an extension of Yugoslavia's liberation from fascism and simultaneous socialist revolution, resulting in a similar non-aligned orientations at least in the immediate aftermath of independence. So we can appreciate the distinctiveness of such readings of Fanon most if we compare them to Soviet readings, right, which criticize Fanon's erroneous understanding of Marxism because he privileges peasantry over the working class as a revolutionary vanguard, as well as his chronic anti-communist prejudice, implying his rejection of the USSR as kind of a vanguard of emancipatory movements. Soviet scholarship also tends to be uncomfortable with his excessive focus on race. Fanon discusses anti-colonial revolutions not, quote, in terms of world socialism and world capitalism, but in terms of third world struggle of people of color against white Europe. Consequently, his focus on overcoming racialized dehumanization and alienation is downplayed as an anarchic or emotional protest, which takes the place of deep socioeconomic analysis necessary to a successful revolution. So Yugoslav readings in Fanon, in contrast, center on his original kind of innovations on leftist and decolonial thought rather than evaluating the extent to which he strays from Marxist models. So praising his Fanon's intimate, poignant, and even poetic analysis of the psychology of colonialism, this scholarship reveals an investment in kind of a humanism, Marxist humanism, rather than in structuralist deep socioeconomic analysis. So they see Fanon's contribution to psychiatry as perhaps even more important than his political engagement, given his profound understanding of colonial trauma and sympathy for those experiencing its double alienation at the hands of the falsely universalist European humanism. They also kind of focus on his revision of Marxist thought in the colonial situation, where the fundamental antagonism revolves around race while intersecting with all other hierarchies. They laud Fanon's phenomenology of blackness, contending that it explores the embodied experience of race and racism as kind of a sociological rather than individual phenomenon. And rather than dismissing his analysis of the despair, or anger, produced by colonial trauma as emotional, right, which would also kind of reinforce stereotypes of irrational blackness, they argue that for Fanon, revolution is itself a process of becoming, the creation of an emancipated human as well as society. So consistent with non-aligned ideals, Fanon's greatest contribution becomes his practical demonstration that, quote, ready-made European models, especially of the Marxist land, cannot be neatly grafted on different social and political contexts. This is not to say that they're always like acclamatory, right? Some of them are most of them support also his understanding of revolutionary violence. Some of them are kind of uncomfortable with that, but this is kind of like a general overview. So to move toward a conclusion, so non-aligned efforts in the spheres of literature and arts have often been criticized as modest or even unsuccessful because none didn't manage to develop a lasting aesthetic or inspire some sort of artistic or literary movement. However, non-alignment, as a literary strategy at least, was not articulated as a set of formal, thematic, aesthetic, or ideological criteria. Rather, it designated a broad platform of what Vijay Prashad calls the poorer nations for acting in common, which always took into account material disparities in the production and dissemination of cultural narratives. So acting in common manifested as mutual aid for independent cultural and aesthetic expressions that will counter colonial imaginaries, as winning their place in global cultural organizations such as PEN or UNESCO, and as developing new literary and theoretical vocabularies that could supplant Eurocentric models. So I argue that we should approach NAM as, among other things, a project of independent knowledge production, reversing non-aligned spaces, long-standing, hold on, sorry, just lost my space again. Yes, so that we should approach it as the project of non-aligned or independent knowledge production, reversing non-aligned spaces' long-standing position as recipients of metropolitan epistemologies, technology, and expertise, whose material disenfranchisement disallowed their contribution to the global circulation of knowledge. So while non-alignment shapes specific critical vocabularies and dispositions in Yugoslavia, I propose also reading other thinkers from the global south through the lens of, including some of the ones that I've been talking about today, through the lens of non-alignment, right? Given that their involvement with its ideas and politics. So from this perspective, like non-alignment can refer not only to literary and theoretical production, but also to a possible mode of reading decoloniality across Cold War divides. And also in light of intensifying Cold War era rhetoric between the US and Russia, and as well as China, I think it's important to revisit the history of engaged writing and cultural diplomacy, which imagined alternatives to superpower conflicts and a bipolar vision and division of the world. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. I just ask that before you ask your question, if you could state your name and your affiliation, just so you know what angle people are. Some people are running to their class at 1. Students. Yes.
I'm Pam Allen from the History Department. Thank you so much for this really rich talk. I'm looking forward to the book. And I just had a question. So your last comments about non-alignment as a literary strategy, and I was wondering, given that we have these translations, as a linguistic strategy. And so if there's discussions, for example, about writing in one of the smaller languages like Slovene, if there's discussions of broader discussions in the non-aligned kind of world about do you use French or do you use an African language, for example, to write? So I'm just wondering about the question of language as a form of expression in the non-aligned, specifically in the Yugoslav space.
So this is a really great question. There's like so many different aspects of it. So yes, I mean, we can even focus on the two literary events that I mentioned, like the Bled Pen Congress, which is in Slovenia, and also the Struga Poetry Evenings, which were in Macedonia today, North Macedonia, which were in a way kind of imagined, at least within the Yugoslav space, as ways of reaffirming these minor languages in Yugoslavia, right? There was a lot of anxiety, especially among the Slovenes. If you read, for instance, the diary of Mira Mihalic, one of the writers who organized the Pen Congress in Slovenia, she said we were anxious to kind of, to show off like Slovenian culture, right? So that we wouldn't just be kind of swallowed up by Yugoslav culture. In Macedonia, one of the reasons behind establishing these Struga Poetry Evenings in Macedonia was precisely to affirm a separate Macedonian language and culture, which was in response to, at the time, Greek and Bulgarian kind of refusals to recognize this as a separate language or a separate cultural identity. And so some of this principle was also kind of followed also in translations, not just in Yugoslavia, but also kind of in conversation with other non-aligned partners, so that a lot of the texts that would have been translated were, as you can see with Fanon, right, they would be translated in multiple languages, right, of the region. Which is not to say that BCMS was not a dominant. Absolutely, it is a dominant language at this point, but nonetheless, we can find also like translations in these other languages as well. When it comes to translation politics with non-aligned countries, there was a lot of, one of the things that they were trying to do is train a lot of translators to be conversant with and to be able to translate from literatures from languages where people didn't speak these languages before, like in the times before socialist Yugoslavia. So an example would be Arabic, right? A lot of people would not be well versed in Arabic unless you had maybe like religious instruction, right? Or were specifically working on like Ottoman histories and things like that. Another language was Spanish, right? Like there was just like no connections between Yugoslavia and like South America, right? So this was like one of the things that they were kind of struggling to do. But that said, there was constantly this, and then of course like various Indian languages, right? India was a very kind of big, a very important non-aligned partner. So they had like a whole training school also for like Hindi and Punjabi and so on. But it was limited, right? So they were also kind of complaining about how they still had to resort to almost like translating things secondhand, right? That they would still kind of rely on like English or Russian or French translations and then translate it into the local languages and vice versa. But there were different kinds of projects, right, that try to kind of bypass that. So for instance, like with India, like they kind of they talked about like, okay, well, Britain is definitely holding a monopoly over Anglo-Indian fiction, right, like Indian literatures in English. So why don't we just kind of leave them alone, and we're just going to focus on Indian fiction or poetry written in like multiple Indian languages and just translate from that, right? So there's definitely a lot of reflection on that. And then also when these kinds of literary exchanges happened, there was the principle of kind of multilingualism, multiculturalism was observed very closely, both in terms of sending people from Yugoslavia to other spaces, but also like accepting people from various linguistic backgrounds in Yugoslavia. So like with India, right, like if you were, let's say, a Punjabi writer and you came on an official exchange to Yugoslavia 1 year, next year it had to be somebody from a different linguistic background. So it was kind of, to kind of make sure that there's some sort of fair redistribution. Łukasz.
Thank you, Nataša. I'm Łukasz Stanek from the School of Architecture. My questions were a more conceptual one. You have suggested non-alignment as that explanatory framework for your material. But the non-alignment in the 1950s was not the one in the 1980s, just as Yugoslavia from the 60s was not the one from the 80s. And I also suspect that, or I would be fairly certain, that from the point of view of the various countries that would be members of the non-alignment, the movement would have different views on the movement. So I was wondering whether that historical and geographical specificity and dynamics of the non-alignment plays a role in your analysis, and then perhaps sort of to reverse that, to what extent your material offers insights into that geographical and historical specificity.
Absolutely, yes. And so in terms of the geographical specificity, I can glean a little bit from Yugoslav archives, because they give me a sense of like how different figures from other countries are kind of like thinking about some of the same issues and where they agree and disagree. But I am also, kind of limited by my knowledge of several languages, right? So I'm kind of hoping that more kind of geographically specific and nationally specific studies of non-alignment will come out, and they are kind of slowly coming out actually. So we'll see kind of like how they kind of compare to one another. But you're right, the shifts are very real. So one of the major shifts you can tell is also in the travel writing, right? Like in the beginning, right? A lot of it is about this kind of new, independent countries, and it's all about like going to either support liberation movements or talk about like what these new countries are doing, and the generational shift of course happens as people who themselves lived through the war and in many cases participated in the war, kind of rotate out of that position or out of diplomatic and political positions, and then you get like a new generation, right? So like in the 70s especially and in the 80s, right, there's more of a pragmatic relationship with non-aligned countries. And so while there's still kind of support for, liberation movements, especially, when the Portuguese colonies are breaking away, like in the 1970s, there's definitely more and more kind of a turn to trade, right? Kind of like pragmatic economic trade and profit. And that is also reflected in the literature of the era, right? In the sense that these subsequent travel writing is written by a number of people for like a number of different reasons, right? Some of them go and they describe like the different kind of like infrastructural and modernization projects. Some of them go and they're just going for like the fun of travel, right? They go on different expeditions, right? So I think a lot of that writing tends to be less kind of overtly political, or I mean, of course it is political, but like it's not, it doesn't really talk about like non-alignment, right? And then we can also see this with just like how like the engagements with critical scholarships and the development of critical theory change, right? That in the 1950s and 60s, it's all about, there's a lot of focus on Fanon and all of these like theories of liberation and decolonization, and then later on, there's like more kind of focus on the questions of cultural representation and self-representation. With India, right, again, there was this optimism in the 1950s and 60s that we can somehow move away from the exoticization, whereas in the 1970s and 80s, it's all about like how do we counter New Age exoticism of India, right? Now that, it's like Yugoslavia, of course, is being kind of flooded by like the, hippie movement, New Age, right? Like all of this, like travels to India and so on to find yourself. So there's that. With in the 1970s and 80s, especially as Yugoslavia becomes kind of crisis ridden, there's interesting conversations taking place about Orientalism, both within the country and in terms of critical scholarship, and they're kind of triggered by the appearance of Said, but they definitely predate that. So you can see that where non-aligned friends from the Muslim world once upon a time would have been non-threatening when the Iranian Revolution happens, right, and when there are kind of more overtly pan-Islamic movements in Yugoslavia happening, there's more anxiety about that, right? So definitely absolute shifts, yeah. So that's kind of how I trace it in my book.
For one more question.
Just looking at these translations, I wonder if you've done reading several of them to see
The differences.
Yeah.
I admit that I have not. I don't speak Albanian. I have attempted reading not this particular text, but I have attempted reading some Slovenian text, but it is challenging to me. I can read Macedonian and Serbian, so I kind of compare those. But I have not actually, unfortunately. So, but it would be interesting, right, to think about also like how things are translated. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Oh, okay. All right, well, thank you so much. Please join me.